Hello, good evening. I'm Nancy Berteau, Professor of Economics and Sustainability, Faculty Co-Chair of Xavier's Sustainability Committee, and I'm active with ECI, the Economics of Compassion Initiative here in Cincinnati. On behalf of fellow members of Sustainability Committee and our co-sponsors for this event, ECI, Xavier's Brueggemann Center for Dialogue, Cincinnati's Green Umbrella, and Xavier's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, we would like to welcome Mark Anielski to Xavier and to welcome students, faculty, staff, and members of the public visiting with us tonight. Xavier's Sustainability Committee's 2014 theme was Water Justice with speakers Maud Barlow and Cynthia Barnett. And 2013's theme was Energy Justice with Amory Lovins and Jeremy Rifkin. This year's theme is Consumption Justice. And in September, we heard political theorist Benjamin Barber argue that a focus on overconsumption has led markets to, quote, corrupt children, infantilize adults, and swallow citizens whole, unquote. We are defining consumption justice as sustainable patterns of consumption that are ecologically sound as well as economically advantageous for all members of society, especially the least well-off. Tonight, we'll hear a presentation by economist and author Mark Anielski. Mark is an ecologically focused economist, specializing in well-being and happiness economics. He's recognized as an international expert in well-being measurement and indicators, as well as a pioneer of natural capital accounting and sustainability measurement. Mark has advised governments and businesses in Canada, the US, China, Bhutan, the Netherlands, Austria, and Tahiti. That's my personal favorite, I think. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Economics of Happiness, Building Genuine Wealth, co-founder of Happiness Solutions Incorporated, and the Chief Well-Being Officer of the Genuine Wealth Institute, a nonprofit think tank that seeks to build a new economy of well-being by empowering people, enterprises, communities, and nations, particularly Indigenous people, or First Nations, as they call them in Canada, with practical tools for measuring and managing what matters most using the Genuine Wealth model. Tonight, Mark will speak on Pope Francis, consumption, justice, and the economics of genuine wealth, building a civilization of love. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for the kind introduction. I actually have the pleasure of knowing Maud Barlow as a friend and Amory Lovins as well, so I feel honored to be standing where they stood. Just let me get my teleprompter notes up here. Nancy was very nervous because I just flew in at 4 o'clock. I thought if I don't make my connection in Minneapolis, Nancy's going to have to give my address, at least for the first hour. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is my second time in Cincinnati. Thank you to Peter Block, who has been my mentor and guide, inspiration. We all need mentors, especially elder mentors, who remind us that not to get too lost and get too discouraged when we think economics really is a dismal science. I hope I don't offend people with what I'm going to say tonight, but I'm going to rattle a few cages, including Pope Francis's cage and Jesuit theologians. If there's any in the room, you should leave now. Just kidding. I want to begin with a prayer. We all know the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And it goes on, but there's an important 2 lines in the Lord's Prayer that I believe we have forgotten. And the original words of Jesus were, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, I don't know, I was raised Catholic. I don't know what a trespass is, other than going on someone's property without permission. So I don't know at what point in our history, maybe it was a Nicene Council, that we changed debt to debtors, debt to trespasses. So that's part of my reflection tonight. Notice I've used the original words that Jesus gave us as documented by Matthew's Gospel. Jesus was clear using the words debt. debts, and debtors. Nowhere have I ever found the New Testament using the word trespass. I keep asking my theology friends and priests when and why these changes were made. I would like to begin by thanking Nancy for her kind invitation to your most cherished and blessed university. I met Nancy the first time at the theology conference, actually the Claremont School of Theology, in May in Claremont, California, with my other mentor, John Cobb Jr., the amazing 90-year-old theologian that keeps just ticking. Amazing man. And he and Herman Daly wrote For the Common Good. It was actually John who inspired me. I thought Herman Daly knew something about money, but it was John who insisted that the second edition of their book had to have a chapter on money, and they said we put it in at the last part of the book. And yet something so important is rarely discussed in our schools. And I have 3 degrees, one in economics, I have an accounting background as well. And never did I remember learning, either from my father or anyone else, where money came from. The world is in a serious muddle. We find ourselves in a state of international debt crisis, systemic debt slavery, and protracted environmental crises in which climate change threatens to shipwreck even the strongest economies. We have created an economy based on the errant teachings of Ayn Rand, who inspired a group of neoclassical economists, including Alan Greenspan, her great devotee, which is founded on a belief of individualism and greed, rather than our natural human inclination of love, compassion, and altruism. Yet the truth is that we are hardwired to be people of compassion, finding meaning in relationships of love. We are told that to strive in this harsh world, we must protect our own interests, hedonistically, hoard money, live a fragmented life and contradictory life, and experience dis-ease. I love that word. I love words, dis-ease. Each person tries to save himself or herself in his own corner. Everyone follows his or her own interests. In my mind, we lack the moral leadership to deal with these crises. Even Pope Francis has, in my mind, not gone far enough, locating the locus of these crises. While the world is celebrating the strength of environmental encyclical Laudato Si', the real source of our economic and spiritual malaise remains unaddressed, hiding in the shadows of our ignorance and amnesia. Though Pope Francis exhorted the world to consider the dangers of the idolatry of money, in 2013, Pope Francis wrote an apostolic exhortation in which he decried the idolatry of money. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a true human purpose. The worldwide crisis affecting finance and economy lays bare their imbalances and, above all, the lack of real concern for human beings. Man and woman, he didn't put woman, by the way, is reduced to one of his needs alone, consumption. I believe at the very heart of the multiple crises we face is the very nature of money and who and how it is created. The love of money, St. Paul said, is the root of all evil. That may be true, but what is the source of money creation, and thus this evil? The subject of money and a relationship with it was dealt with by Jesus over 2,000 years ago, and I believe was the ultimate reason for his crucifixion. I believe the money power crucified Christ. And it's the same money power today that threatens the world on Wall Street and in London, the Corporation of London. It is the same money power that led to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm a Canadian. In my book, The Economics of Happiness, I delve into the real nature of the words of economy and business. For example, the word wealth comes from the 13th century Old English, meaning the conditions of well-being. The word economy, anyone who's studying economics here should know, at least your grade 10 students, that the word economy comes from the Greek oikos, household, nomia, or stewardship or management. And my favorite word, mortgage, comes from the French, a death pledge. Why don't we change that word? What about the word competition, from the Latin competere, to strive together? We need to find new ways of measuring progress. Robert Kennedy, 1968, in an address to the before his assassination, critiqued the gross domestic product as being flawed in not measuring the joy of her children's play or the integrity of her public discourse. He said the GDP measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. I've dedicated my professional career to develop these new measures of progress, measures that actually matter to our quality of life. Fortunately, a few entrepreneurial economists like Herman Daly and others have come up with a new measure, the Genuine Progress Indicator. I've worked on developing a new accounting system because I was traumatized by accounting, or at least hopefully made aware that part of our solution to the crisis we have is a change in our way we account for progress, therefore our accounting system itself. I believe it's time for a new bottom line. I'm going to call it a well-being ROI, return on investment. My proposed new model is based on a 500-year-old story and tradition of double-entry bookkeeping, which began with a Franciscan monk mathematician named Luca Pacioli and his student Leonardo da Vinci. In 1492, they wrote the Summa Arithmetica and Divina Proporzione. If you have to say that fast because it's Latin. Those are the treatises which guide accountants to this day. In a world of Venetian guilds, Luca developed a system of accounting that will allow business people to measure their assets relative to the risks or liabilities to the business, while respecting the importance of equity or fair distribution of the wealth of a company. Luca said that a wise business person begins by taking an inventory of their assets, which requires a physical accounting. I remember my first day auditing as a young auditor with Coopers and Lybrand. I was 21 years old, now PwC. And we went into the Honda dealership and we had to go out in the yard and count Civics and Accords, and then we worried about their market value. So Luca was resonating. Of course, I never knew about Luca until many years later. Luca said that accounting was a form of accountability to God, for, he said, all wealth comes from God. This is why the original financial statements used to use the words, in the year of our Lord. Remarkably, Luca never once defined the word profit. And to this day, accountants lack a clear definition of that term. In an era of professional guilds of Venice, the members shared the revenues of their collective success. If anything was left over, it was called a residual. That residual then was either given to the poor or retained by the members. What Luca gave the world is a process of creating a balance sheet that accounted for both the assets and liabilities of an enterprise. But accountants and economists don't really see eye to eye. That's because accountants drive the vehicle with the rear view mirror, and economists pretend that they can have a crystal ball of the future and make all kinds of crazy projections. Have you ever thought why economists don't get fired because their projections were wrong or off? Predicting GDP growth at 2% every year. Actually, I'll tell you why that's so easy. It's a no-brainer. Fortunately and unfortunately, I am trained in both economics and accounting, and what I've come to learn is that best we can only manage what we currently know. We must be attentive to the conditions of well-being of the present and not be distracted by the past, but learn from it, and not be tempted to be predictors of the future. A nation without a balance sheet is like Coca-Cola without its brand. One of the great revelations of my economic career has been that governments of all types manage the state of an economy without a formal balance sheet. Well, what does that mean? It means that neither Cincinnati or Ohio or the United States of America has a formal accounting of the full suite of assets of this nation, including the human capital, your people, your spirit, and your spiritual well-being, your social capital, the strength of your marriages and relationships of trust, of social cohesion, and especially natural capital, the amazing landscapes, forests, watersheds, and ecosystems that contribute to our well-being yet go unaccounted for. If our economy is like flying a Boeing 777, we are flying the economy with only the joystick of GDP. All other indicators of the true wealth or assets of the nation go unaccounted for as our GDP speeds along without any alert signs that we might be damaging our human, social, or natural assets at the expense of our addiction to materialism, consumption, productivity, and the cult of economic growth. I often muse that Warren Buffett would be most upset if he did not see the balance sheet of his beloved Coca-Cola. Coke's balance sheet reveals the valuation of its intangible assets, its brand, as roughly 25% of its total assets. What is the brand value of Ohio or Cincinnati? What is the value of the human spirit and the overall well-being of your city? More growth for whom and for what? A serious question arises, why does the economy have to keep growing by 2%, let's say, a year? When people have enough, when the well-being have met unprecedented levels, except in some of your impoverished neighborhoods, where some of your black communities don't earn a living wage, which is an injustice and unnecessary. Most certainly there is still too much poverty and too many who try to survive economically without a living wage. This income inequity should be a flashing red light on the equity side of our nation's balance sheet, along with the costs of inequality that show up on the liability column. But because there's no official balance sheet, these social attributes get ignored. Simon Kuznets, the great economist, who gave us the Kuznets curve, but he gave us something more. He actually developed the national income accounts for the United States and gave us GDP. Said that, this is around World War II, with John Maynard Keynes, who also developed the system in Britain, said when economists or politicians call for more economic growth, they're responsible defining for what and for whom. So ask your new presidential candidates, including Donald Trump, for what growth they expect and for whom. Debt money is the key driver of GDP growth. This is a shock and awe part, and it just gets worse, and then it gets better, just like a movie, right? Standard script. What few people understand, including most economists, is that the nature of economic growth is the key driver of this growth obsession is debt money. This shocking revelation that debt money and GDP are highly correlated came to me when I visited Herman Daly in 1999 working on the U.S. Genuine Progress Indicator. And I went to his Maryland office, and I thought, this man is incredible. His office is in a broom closet. The economics department won't have him. And I started to laugh, because if anyone's ever met Herman, he's the most remarkable human being. If anyone should win the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way, the Nobel Prize in economics is given by? Banks, thank you. Not the Nobel Committee. So here I come up to him and I say, it's such a pleasure to meet you. And he reaches out with his one arm while he has no other arm. And I thought, oh man, this guy's the sweetest economist, because the whole joke about economists, they can't make up their mind on one hand, and the other hand is like, when Herman talks, he's always right. Herman encouraged me to dedicate my career in understanding this otherwise obscure fact that the nature of money as debt is a key driver of economic growth. Even more obscure is the fact that 98% of our modern money is created by private banks when they issue loans, including mortgages, to households, businesses, and governments. Only 2% of our money comes from plastic or paper currency, created free of charge by the government. This debt money, which is under the control of private corporations, is not connected to anything real, nor is it accountable to the shareholders of the nation. Notice I said shareholders, not shareholders. You and I. If you can't operate Coca-Cola without a balance sheet, how can you run our money system without a proper balance sheet for the nation? I ask the Federal Reserve. Ask anyone who works with the U.S. Federal Reserve whether their monetary policies are guided by a balance sheet. I guarantee you'll get a blank stare. The big problem with debt money is that the amount of debts in society keeps growing through the magic of compound interest and can never be repaid, no matter how much GDP grows. The best we can do is pay for the interest payments. This means that there's a natural growth bias hardwired into our economic system. Let me try to explain this to you. I know, Nancy, I came here promising that I would talk about my visit with Pope Francis in his office on October 20th. It was planned, but as you know, the Holy Spirit has different plans. Sometimes you've got to pay attention and avoid maybe a trap. So I have a dear friend in Edmonton, and she said, I'm going to Rome. It was Wednesday. She says, when are you going? I said, Friday. I'll be in Vatican Square on Saturday. Her name's Bea. And I said, I've had friends have dreams I'm going to be advising the Pope and I've got to get my book to the Pope. So I said, Bea, can you do me a favor? I know it's crazy, but I know you're probably not going to see him, but can you take my book to the Vatican? And I'll write a letter to the Pope and I'll seal it in an envelope. And the letter starts off with, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, Matthew," and compelling the Pope to do something. So Saturday, I get a selfie from her with the book, my book, against the the apartment window open, and the Pope's giving the blessing. I'm like, wow. I said, "Did you throw it up to him?" She said, "I'm being arrested." So she said, "I did better for you, Mark." He says, "I went back there 15 minutes before they closed the Vatican Square with my girlfriends. And I said, I promised my friend, Mark, I'd get this book to the Pope. So I'm just going to go up to one of those funny-looking guys over there. You mean the Swiss guard? Can't talk to the Swiss guard." And she says, "I will. I promised my friend." So she went up and she says, "Do you speak English?" And he says, "Do you speak Italian?" So you know those guys are funny with their funny pants. And she said, no, Signora, we know it. We don't talk to you. We're not supposed to." And her girlfriend's like, "Don't talk to them." Right? And so she persists. She goes, "I promised my friend." And she says, so they get on the radios, "Come with us, Signora." So they take her to behind this huge electric fence. Policeman, "You sit in there, sit in the van." Head of security comes, greets her, takes her into the Vatican Gardens. Said, "You're staying tonight." She goes, No, I can't stay tonight." "We'll feed you, don't worry." Says, No, I just want, we know you want to get this book to the Pope. Okay, we'll make sure this gets to the Pope. So part of my reason for wanting to go on October 20th, and it was all arranged, was to see if the Pope had my letter. And this is what my letter said. "Dear Pope Francis, you are holding in your hands a copy of my book, The Economics of Happiness, released in 2007. The book was inspired by my business students, but primarily by the Holy Spirit and the Blessed Mother of our Lord Jesus Christ. My book lays out a concrete game plan for developing a new economic model for the world based on well-being and the true definition of happiness, oidaimonia, which you should know means the well-being of the spirit in Greek. I propose this economic model based on well-being rather than on pure economic growth to world leaders such as George Soros at the World Economic Forum, and to my own Archbishop Richard Smith of Edmonton. I'm an ecological economist by profession and have been called God's auditor by my mentor, Herman Daly. Not that I would put such a title on my business card when I visit you. I was heartened by your interest, your latest encyclical, Laudato Si, on the need for an ecological conversion, whereby the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Your words and that of St. Francis of Assisi provide an important moral and ethical foundation upon which we can build what St. Paul called a civilization of love. John Paul II noted in 2003, while meeting with the new ambassador of the Czech Republic, he said the most remarkable following words: "Authentic development can never be attained solely through economic means. In fact, what has become known as the idolatry of the market, a consequence of the so-called civilization of consumption, tends to reduce persons to things and subordinates being to having. This seriously detracts from the dignity of the human person and makes promotion of human solidarity difficult at best. Indeed, recognition of the spiritual nature of the human person and a renewed appreciation of the moral character of social and economic development must be acknowledged as prerequisites for the transformation of our society into a true civilization of love." And I go on. In order to build a true civilization of love requires that we as Christians and Catholics address our relationship with money as well as who and how it is created. In truth, 98% of our world money supply is created by private banks when they issue loans. This debt money imposes significant interest costs on all of society and the natural environment. I've calculated the cost of interest payments to our economic lives of private debt money currently consumes roughly 35 to 50% of any nation's GDP. In the US alone, roughly 36 cents of every dollar spent by Americans will go to pay for interest on the total amount of outstanding and rising mountain of debt, now exceeding $60 trillion and unrepayable. The evidence is clear. Millions of people and our natural environment are suffering each day because of the burden debt money in the form of unnecessary interests as a consequence of accepting usury. The truth is that none of these interest costs would be necessary if the power to create money was returned to the people through governments who would create the necessary money ex nihilo. What does that mean? Latin, just kidding. It's not a test. To provide sufficiency of human material needs and to be better stewards of our environment. Why is it that we accept debt slavery? Why do we accept usury, the charging of interest on money, which Plato, Thomas Aquinas, and even John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, called the extraction of usury a misdemeanor against humanity? As a student of the money system and church teaching, I have learned that the Catholic Church, while historically forbidding the charging of interest on loans, went silent on the issue in the mid-19th century. It is time for new church ethical teachings on money, debt, and usury. I'm inviting you, Pope Francis, to lead with your moral authority a new teaching encyclical on money, debt, forgiveness, usury, and jubilee. A universal declaration of debt jubilee in the spirit of the words Jesus Christ gave us in the original Lord's Prayer. I believe the world is on the brink of a massive debt crisis that threatens to inflame the world in economic chaos, a crisis even larger than climate change. I would like to humbly offer my economic advisory services to your office and to the Vatican in union with the Archbishop of Edmonton to help prepare a new teaching, along with my good friend Professor Stefano Zamagna of Bologna, who sits on your Council for Peace and Justice, and who co-authored Caritas in Veritate with Pope Benedict. I pray that my book brings you heart great joy, inspires you to act with love for the well-being of all humanity. In the love of Jesus Christ, Mark. That was it. Today, I have had no response from the Pope or the Council of Justice and Peace. I'm not surprised. Kind of maybe ruffled some feathers. Maybe it didn't even get, maybe it was shredded before it even got to him. So as I said, I was supposed to have this near meeting with the Pope on the 20th of October at the last week of the Synod of the Family. I was invited by some friends who are working with Indigenous people, the Algonquin people of Quebec, our eastern province. The Algonquin people, like the Iroquois, the First Nations of Turtle Island. That's what North America was called. My mission was to join them to appeal to the Pope to acknowledge the cultural injustices imposed on the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. My goal was to find out whether Pope Francis indeed had received my book. My Indigenous friends represented the interests of the Algonquin Nation of Quebec and the Ottawa or Ottawa watershed. They were asking for an admission by Pope Francis and the Church of the existence of a document called the Doctrine of Discovery, that some believe gave permission to Cortes and Columbus to go subjugate Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Some believe that the Fifth Church Age, which began in 1520 with Cortes, coming to the Aztec nation and taking their gold, is coming to an end. More importantly, I would learn that the expropriation of Turtle Island and the abundance of natural assets, along with a cultural genocide, was one of the greatest triumphs of the so-called money power, which still resides in the city of London, the ancient Londonium of Rome, the seat of world banking power and money power. What I've learned from working with Indigenous people in Canada, that they have a deep understanding of commonwealth that reminds me of Luca Pacioli's teachings, that all wealth comes from the Creator or God. These Indigenous people had no system of property rights. They had no formal form of money other than the use of a tiny seashell that came from the Maori from New Zealand, Ataroa. They used simple things to exchange, like seashells, which the ancient Chinese Indigenous people of Taiwan used to use. The expropriation of the natural assets of Turtle Island represents the greatest theft in human history, from a people who still remind us to be comfortable with the abundance of nature, that you can't eat money, and the tree of life still lives and calls us back to its abundant giving. For too long, we've been addicted to the tree of knowledge. Perhaps we are learning that there is no thing to do when the tree of life was sufficient for all our needs. Indigenous cultures remind us through their ceremonies of smudging, the use of sweet grass and sage, the peace pipe, the sun dance, the sweat lodge, which I've enjoyed. It's a near-death experience, believe me. It gets so hot. That when we give thanks and tribute to the Creator for all we have, then we have the chance to live a healthy economic life. I had many experiences with First Nation elders who reminded me that beginning with a thanks to the Creator for all that is gifted us, and then all meetings and relationships seem to operate more smoothly. Indigenous cultures teach us that our economic well-being cannot be separated from the natural environment. To do so is a sign of insanity. In essence, our villages and cities and environment are a common home. Indeed, the words economy and ecology share the same root, oikos, meaning household. My role with the Algonquin Nation wasn't just to appeal for this Doctrine of Discovery letters, if that would change anything, but in fact to appeal to the Pope with a new model. We call it the Earth Dollar. We created the Earth Dollar, a form of cryptocurrency like the Bitcoin, except unlike the Bitcoin, which is a mathematical algorithm, the Earth Dollar is tied directly to the ecological health of the Ottawa watershed. It is the watershed that is the originator of our money, or liquidity, notice the words. What if the watershed was a working model of genuine currency and the banks of the river are real banks? See the language? You see, money must be like water. It must flow, for if it is stored up behind dams and human hubris, it putrefies and becomes undrinkable. We weren't ready with our proposal yet to Pope Francis, nor were we ready to appeal to Cardinal Turkson of Ghana with our new model. But I do see the Earth Dollar as a form of financial justice for Indigenous people. I have the pleasure of working with them on these aspirations. And I believe it could become a working model for the implementation of Laudato Si. So Laudato Si, the beautiful encyclical, I probably won't spend that much time on it, even though I promised to. If anyone's read it, you know what it's about. But the important thing, it was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. I spent time in Assisi myself on my own vision quest when I was 32, when I went to Jerusalem to get my calling to come back into the Temple of Economics. I wanted to be a monk or a priest. I was telling Rob, and Rob and I both aspire to going back in the monastery. Why is that? Because maybe we can get more stuff done when we're quiet. We're chatting so much. So what did St. Francis teach us? I believe St. Francis is undoubtedly the patron saint of the environment and would be a champion for an ecological civilization and ecological justice. St. Francis was a model on how to love for all of creation. He had a relationship with nature, with birds and flowers, animals and land. Having rejected the monetary and wealth of his aristocratic father, Francis espoused an ethic of right relationship with God and with nature. His canticle to the sun was a perfect reminder to us that we all are called to a harmonious and joyful relationship with nature, that a healthy environment is an extension of God's love. Okay, here's when I get a little punchy. The Pope needs to go further. While I'm encouraged by the Pope's encyclical, I feel he has not gone far enough in locating one of the key sources of our ecological crisis. I believe the source of our complex relationship with money and material things is at the heart of this. In the wealthier nations, we see a pandemic of fear about money, either not having enough or having too much. We seem addicted to feeding our wants, even though most of our needs have been satisfied. We have, as Pope John Paul II said in 2003, come under a spell of consumerism and materialism. Pope John Paul II challenged the world to go beyond this obsession, this idolatry with the market. John Paul II, I think, would agree with our vision for an ecological civilization. For a true civilization of love is, in my mind, the ultimate frontier. My main concern with the teachings of Pope Francis is that he fails to address a fundamental driver of our economic systems. As I've said, that this debt-based system is the fundamental component of our GDP now, and will grow so large, like cancer, it will consume the host. That's what will eventually happen. It is remarkable when you look back at the debt statistics of the United States that the debt mountain has doubled roughly every 7 years. Well, anyone who's been studying Jubilee knows what I'm talking about. In another 7 years, so currently the debt sits around $60 trillion. If you include Medicare and all those other costs, it's $122 trillion. There's some great imagery on the internet. You can see how much $100 bills stack up to. In 7 years, the U.S. debt will have reached $120 trillion. The interest payments on the national debt I believe now exceed the expenditures on the U.S. military. Some say that was the end of Rome. Even now, the U.S. debt imposes on each citizen 35 cents of interest costs on every dollar we spend. That means that the average American will work a third of their life just paying for the interest payments on the collective debt of the nation. What most don't realize is that this is completely unnecessary, as money could be created without debt and without the interest burden if governments assume the responsibility, as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln understood. But where are these debates today in your presidential election? Can you imagine if you had 30 to 50% more of your daily work freed up because you didn't have to work for interest? What would you do with that time? Maybe it would be really irresponsible. Maybe our kids would be really irresponsible. I'm not sure. The pressures on all of humanity and the injustice imposed by the acceptance of usury would end in a flash. Greenhouse gas emissions would plummet as less oil and gas would be necessary to fuel debt repayments. We'd have more time to spend with our aging parents, more quality time with our kids. Mortgages would be dead. No longer would couples have to pay 2.5 times the value of their home, but only would pay the principal. We would quickly remove a significant amount of carbon embedded in the interest costs in our economy, freeing up human energy, providing new and discretionary human capacities to rapidly increase renewable energy capacity, retool our economy to achieve the goals of an ecological civilization, and possibly a civilization of love. Stepping on the dragon's tail. Pope Francis has not yet entered the thorny issue of monetary policy and the nature of money, though he has made some bold statements calling the love of money the dung of the devil, in reference to a 4th century bishop. So this has been with us for a long time. He has thus far not provoked the sleeping dragon of the money power, as Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson did. Lincoln referred to the money power as a den of vipers. And Thomas Jefferson said private banks and their power are more dangerous than standing armies. They're not my words. What did Donald Trump think? Stepping on the dragon's tail won't be easy, and it will unleash a roar from the money power. Thank goodness we have the model of Mary, the mother of Jesus, as our example of a woman who will crush the head of the serpent. At least that's what we're told if you read Genesis. Mary is our model. Why? Because it is her fiat that changes everything. The word fiat means yes. It was her fiat to the angel Gabriel that changed everything. And guess what we call money? Fiat. I think it's time to change the counterfeit to a real fiat. When will this nightmare end? When will this debt nightmare end? Who will be our economic savior? Who will be the Luke Skywalker, the Harry Potter, the Frodo, the Samwise, or Neo? Perhaps the debt system will collapse on itself, choking on its own hubris and greed. Perhaps the money matrix will begin to fragment on its own, perhaps pushed by a young rogue Wall Street trader who knows the injustice of the system he or she is part of and feels a call from the Holy Spirit to end the slavery of debt tonight. No one can say how the debt slavery system will end, but make no mistakes, we're debt slaves, and we don't even know it, unlike the Israelites and Moses. I am under no illusion that one man, Pope Francis or any pope, could issue a new canon law or another encyclical that would compel bankers in London and New York to turn into a Mother Teresa, forgiving all debts and a global debt jubilee by resetting our ticking debt time bomb to zero. Pope Francis has spoken out against the dark side of capitalism and the love of money. He said in Bolivia in July, "Behind all this pain, death, and destruction, there is a sketch of what Basil of Caesarea called the dung of the devil. An unfettered pursuit of money rules. The service of the common good is left behind. Once capital becomes an idol and guides people's decisions, once greed for money presides over the entire socioeconomic system, it ruins society, it condemns and enslaves men and women." Oh, good, he used the word woman. "And destroys human fraternity. It sets people against one another, as we clearly see. It even puts at risk our common home." Peter's going to love this. Okay, now we get into the hopeful. That was pretty dark, right? Okay, everyone wait. Okay, we're going to have a Henry Ford once said, if people just knew how the banks create money, there'd be a revolution tonight. Well, there won't be a revolution in America, so. Solutions are in our neighborhoods. I'm compelled by the efforts of ordinary friends and neighbors who are beginning to examine their own relationship with money. We're beginning to meet as Christians and Catholics and Muslims and others to talk about our strange relationship with money. Thank you to Peter and the Economics of Compassion. People are doing that in Cincinnati, and it's happening. There's this kind of slow groundswell, maybe not making the media, but something's happening. We're beginning to build circles to explore the possibility of creating interest-free trusts, credit unions, and even banks where interest charges are no longer required. I studied one of these in Stockholm, Sweden, called a Yacht Bank, where they don't charge interest on principal because they say we reject usury. And it was designed by engineers, not economists, because engineers at least understand flow. And why? Because we will begin to renew our trust with each other. We'll start to talk about money like it's the weather, things that we're told not to talk about. We're already giving without expectation of a return on our money. Things like Kiva, where $25 goes a long way, to Banana Cooperative, a few women in Ghana. We're forming lending circles. We're opening discussions about credit card debt forgiveness, and perhaps we'll have the courage to help our neighbors be free of that 18 to 24% annual interest charge with a generous 2% neighbor line of genuine credit. We're learning to become more financially literate and more responsible with our money. We are relearning to live within our means and reject the lure of easy credit and the addiction of material things. We're learning that when we are free of debts, we have more discretionary time to spend in doing the things God created us to do, endowed with the gifts that will become increasingly self-evident, as per the words of the Declaration of Independence. We're learning about the abundance and often idle assets that live in our neighborhoods. These idle assets include that pickup truck that everyone on the block might borrow from Joe, or Mary, who has the gift of healing through her practice of Reiki, or perhaps the 15-year-old Amanda who has some free time when she is no longer hooked to her technology to spend time with 85-year-old Angela, an elder who has stories of her past that can inspire Amanda and her peers. These are the idle assets in our community, in our neighborhoods. They don't need money to get an economy of community and compassion to flourish. This is something we can start tomorrow, and we are pursuing in Edmonton, inspired by the work of my elders, Peter Block, John McKnight, and Walter Brueggemann. How do we leave Pharaoh's Egypt? Walter Brueggemann's made some amazing reflections. Are we not like, right, a modern, Jewish people that I think, what a crazy idea that this Moses, who was that right-hand guy of the Pharaoh, decides one day God knocks on him and he says, lead my people set my people free. All right, where are we going? We're gonna go over there somewhere in the Sinai. Well, got to cross that big body of water. Are you crazy? What kind of crazy man does that? But I think we're kind of in the same situation. But the worst part is we don't even know we're slaves. At least the Jews knew they had chains or something. They were bound to labor. How are we going to do this? Buckminster Fuller once said that to change the existing system, one must design a more compelling parallel operating system. This was also the lesson of Sun Tzu, who gave us the art of war, who said, the way to change your enemy is to compel them that your ideas are more compelling than theirs. That's how you win a war. Leaving the modern version of Egypt and Pharaoh's debt slavery won't be easy. It must have been difficult for Moses to compel the fellow Jews to leave the comforts of Egypt, albeit enslaved, and attempt to cross the chasm of the Red Sea, to enter the Sinai desert, only for most of them to die, never reaching the promised land. Yet God showered them with love and the abundance of manna that fell from the skies that became corruptible at night. The Israelites were completely dependent on God's grace and mercy. Of course, they were tempted to slip back into the comforts of Egypt by building a new golden calf, their icon of the money power, but Moses persisted. Are we not like Moses and the Israelites of old? Or are we worse off because we don't realize we're slave in a system like Neo in the Matrix? If you don't know you're a slave, why would you listen to a crazy economist like me who's compelling others to walk away from the system of usury and build a new, more compelling operating system? How can we cross the Red Sea of debt? What will we eat? What will we do with all that extra discretionary time? Will we be prone to the temptation of sloth and laziness? Perhaps we can't expect a Hail Mary from Pope Francis. But here, in this time of extreme unction and challenges, God gave Moses 10 commandments and economic laws, the cornerstones for an economy of love and compassion. God told Moses about how to deal with money, to pause every 7 days to give thanks to God, to forgive debts every 7 years, and to redistribute wealth every 7 times 7 years, or 49 years. Notice those lovely sevens, something called the Jubilee. The only beef I have with the story of Moses, I don't believe God would now distinguish between charging interest on Gentiles and not to Jews. I think Jesus gave us the commandment we all need to remember, to love God and neighbor as oneself. This love means that we cannot become addicted to the love of money, lest we forgo living the most important of all the commandments. My final appeal is to theologians. We're the voices of our Catholic theologians, including those here at Xavier University, who are speaking out against the injustice of that money and usury, and reminding us of the words of Jesus in the Lord's Prayer. How can we stand today with the Blessed Virgin Mary, who showed us how to humble ourselves before God and give our fiat as she did, serving God to love and to help bring upon the world a civilization of love? How can we build neighborhoods and economies of compassion like some here in Cincinnati are doing? We have a responsibility to right this injustice, to return the power of money to the people, to review and end the practice of usury and bring back the old teachings of Aristotle and Aquinas, and even economist John Maynard Keynes. The fact that the money system is not part of the current presidential candidate debate is telling. It was a key feature of the presidential debate in 1900 when William Jennings Bryan was campaigning for president. Bryan's campaign against the cross of gold, as he called it, was captured in a metaphorical, legendary book by Frank Baum, known as The Wizard of Oz. Oz stands for ounces of gold, by the way. That most people, including our leaders, have no idea the debt money system is controlled by private corporations, and that the collapse of this debt Ponzi scheme is imminent, and that private banks are, according to the words of Thomas Jefferson, more dangerous than the standing armies, is a reflection of the amnesia of the people. Proposing an end to usury and debt banking seems to be more difficult for the church than to address the other injustices, including climate change. Yet it is the most important issue of all. The situation is as complex as Moses when he was called by God to leave with the Israelites from Pharaoh's Egypt. I suspect many Israelites, again, had no interest in leaving Egypt and spending 40 years in the Sinai. What I'm calling for is perhaps more daunting, since unlike the Israelites, 99% of us are completely unaware that we are debt slaves. Most of us oblivious that we will trade a third of our life energy working to pay interest. This form of financial injustice can only come, unfortunately, I believe, with the utter collapse of the current economic Titanic. Our challenge is to build a more beautiful, joyful, and love-based operating system that makes the old one obsolete. Jesus gave us the tools of prayer and showed us the path of love. God gave us the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. Yet we rejected that too, tempted by the desire to know and continuing to eat from the tree of knowledge. We are a stubborn people. Jesus gave us the most singular, powerful prayer of all. So lest we forget that we should forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Perhaps then we will find the strength and conviction to end usury, the civilization of consumption, and build this new civilization of love that God longs us to co-create. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we have time for dialogue and questions. For the purposes of the video there, Mark is going to repeat whatever question you ask back and then answer it so that it'll be audible on the video. So go ahead and stand up if you've got a question. All right. And you're going to have to yell it out probably.
This will be the happy part of the session.
Thank you for that. That's such an inspiring. I have a two-part question. The first is the ideas of the economist Schumacher and All is Beautiful. I wonder how they relate, because I often hear them in the same vein, and if you have any comment on that. The second is the rise of equity finance. I'm particularly interested in this in the context of Islamic financing, which is a very rapidly growing field. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
So the first question was reflection on Schumacher's seminal work, Small is Beautiful. And the second was the rise of equity financing, particularly as highly developed in Islam under particular Sharia law. So the first is to say I know Satish Kumar, who's the head of the Schumacher School, and in fact we were on the stage together in The Hague at the new World Financial Forum a few years ago, and Satish he's a Janus. If anyone knows what Janus monks do, they go for these long walks, and so I'm sitting next to his wife Jane, who says, "I'm just a gardener," and Satish says, "Once I lectured at the London School of Economics, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm using his I think he's from Sri Lanka. You're graduating half-wits." He says, "What do you mean half-wits?" He's like, "Well, you've thrown out the ecology and from the economics because they're both very connected." Small is Beautiful, I actually reflect on it, the 25th anniversary edition in my book. I think Schumacher himself was an interesting guy. He was a Brit. He went to Burma, was it? And he learned something about, he was intrigued by Buddhist kind of understanding of economy. And if anyone knows anything about ethics and one thing I used to teach my business students, or virtue, I say, with second class, I taught corporate social responsibility for 10 years at the School of Business, and I said, your homework is to look at the different virtues of different religions. And what I loved about Buddhism is it was very clear about right relationship, right? So everything, as if there is a right way, there's a proper way of doing things. So I think Buddhism has, and Schumacher's ideas has a lot. Of course, Schumacher realized, I think, that he was up against the Titanic of, economic growth. I could talk a lot about this. I've advised the Chinese government at the highest levels. I think all of us are kind of stuck in a system, and I continue to say I think the key driver of that is this debt money system that puts pressure on this need for growth, and actually can't stop growing because there's no way, otherwise the thing will just run out of oxygen, will collapse. On the question of Sharia or Islamic banks have been, the interest-free bank I studied in Sweden, I studied very forensically, and I said, could Canadian banks operate without charging interest like the Swedish bank, which was designed in Denmark 45 years ago? And I concluded yes, and what was remarkable is the Imam of Stockholm gave blessing to Muslims to bank at the interest-free bank. So there's some young Muslims in Edmonton who want me to advise them on how to create an interest-free bank. Because, I don't know if you know this, but if you're a Muslim, you're actually you're forbidden to charge or pay interest. So Islamic banks, they'll own your property outright, and they'll issue you a loan, but only recover the operating costs of managing that bank. That's exactly how the Swedish bank works. So they reject charging any interest. There's no interest necessary to charge. So it's an interesting model, and it's a kind of new form of I guess sharing in the risk of equity. That our primary one is, of course, homes. Question?
Stand up.
Let's say it's a year from now, and President-elect Sanders calls you up and says he wants you to be Secretary of Treasury.
It won't happen. Look what happened to Obama.
And he says, I want to do what you want to do. And he says that between Wall Street and Congress, they're going to shut down the economy. What's your next step?
I think that's what Obama faced. I mean, I remember second week of his first term, I went, did David Corton get invited to see Barack? No. Who was around him? Summers, same old guys. It makes sense. I mean, the same guys that control the system. The U.S. Federal Reserve is a private corporation, incorporated by private banks in Jekyll Island, and nothing's changed. And so I don't, the problem is I don't see, I mean, if you go and look at your own history and you look at what Ben Franklin, and again, I'm not American, so we have a slightly different story in Canada. We didn't go down that path. Britain did. Britain did in 1694 with the Bank of England. So we have a long amnesia about what is possible. But go back to the Founding Fathers' description. Why was the War of Revolution fought? To decouple from those banks in England, in London. And so you have to kind of return. It's going to be hard to go back. You know, try to go back 2-3 generations to Abraham Lincoln's time and say, I know, we want to blow up, we're going to forgive all the debts in the nation. We're going to just neutralize that $7 trillion in national debt. We're going to just clear the books. And then we're going to put in place, this is what I would do. If I was called to advise whoever the president is, I'd say, first thing, day one, I want all the young economists in the country to help me. I'm going to take inventory of the country's land, buildings, bridges, roads, people, right? I'm going to do a full asset inventory. That's what accountants do. And then I'm going to think about, well, what do I want to sustain here? If I want an economy of well-being, whatever that means, how do I want those assets to behave? What do I want those assets, should the bridges look like? Should we be driving Chevy Volts or Priuses or Teslas? Or I'm not saying we would dictate any of that, but that we would have to look seriously about how the assets of our nation are delivering a well-being return on that investment. And we can create any kind of money system we want to support that. Now, that would be my wildest dreams. I don't think it's going to, it's not going to happen because the whole world is in a debt situation. So the only condition I can see that would ever lead to this would be a collapse of the entire system, which actually could happen. We almost saw it in 2008. So these are some of that's kind of the bad news. So yeah, I've got, on my laptop here, I've got all right, I can download this for you. Here's the operating system. We've done it for a watershed in Quebec. I could value the watershed at $3 trillion and tell the watershed generate enough liquidity for living wages for everyone in Ottawa and all those Indigenous people, and clean up the watershed, make it healthy again. Stop exporting excess materials from Canada, because we could close our borders. We don't need to trade with anyone. All those are things. Those would be the tough things that I would urge any president, any leader to do, including our new prime minister. But they don't invite me. Say this, like, dudes, you're not running. Like, this is terrible. Like, you have no balance sheet. You're not. What happened to public accounting? That they missed that important part. Anyways, I digress. Question back there.
From what source does this interest-free bank in Sweden get its money to lend out because it's free without paying interest for itself?
So the question is, this interest-free bank in Sweden, which is called the JAK Members Bank. JAK stands for Land, Labor, and Capital in Danish. So the Danes kind of started it, a bunch of farmers. So how did they start? The farmers in Denmark realized we couldn't get credit from the banks. So what if we started to pool our cash, our liquidity, and then we begin to lend to each other? That's how it starts. So in effect, it's a lending circle that a quarter of the funds are then invested in Swedish treasury. So that's their hedge against potential default. It's a very cool system. It's a kind of a forced saving system. So at the beginning, the loans are very small. Maybe, because it just depends on how many people. We could create it tonight. We say, who's got $1,000? We're gonna build this interest-free bank in Cincinnati right now, right? We could do it. We don't even need a legal document. We do it in our churches, and so of course, we've got the operating model. We can go to Sweden and learn from them. So but the problem too is the JAK Bank operates still within this larger matrix, right? So if you think about would you be crazy to put your money in an interest-free deposit account when everything else is growing at least by 0.5%? So there's inflation, right, which is eroding the value of that pool. So not everyone, of course, puts all their money in this bank. So these are some of the challenges, but it exists as a model, as a template for what's possible. And that's what I was intrigued by. It is possible to do banking without interest. And the point is that the costs of running the bank are recovered. It's a cooperative membership structure. So we all put $50 in a year. The costs of operating the bank are recovered through what they call a loan fee. So that fee just covers, it's just like any business, right? Say it's 1% of the cost of any loan. And it operates pretty efficiently. And there's no marketing. It's all word of mouth. It's by coffee clubs across Sweden.
My question is more on accounting for.
Oh, you're the accounting student, aren't you?
So I'm curious more about the like genuine progress index and how companies are taking into account and reporting on non-financial metrics and kind of what your thoughts are about how that lines up with your metrics. You know, they're looking at human rights and sourcing of where their products are going and how it gets to the consumer, like water footprint, other sustainability reporting.
Right. So the question is, which is the subject of lots of interest, is how are companies starting to account for these, what I would call these intangible assets, water footprint, things like trust and relationships, right? So-called intangibles. Well, some of us recognize that we've gone long enough since World War II that we've moved from a kind of a built infrastructure kind of economy to what I would call relational economy, where the assets of most companies now are more trust. And if you're studying accounting, what do your accounting professors tell you about goodwill? How should you value it?
Just evaluate inherently.
And how do you determine the value of goodwill?
There are a lot of qualitative and quantitative measures.
That sounds like mumbo jumbo to me. Sorry.
If you want me to
Where's an accounting professor? No, that's a good point. So goodwill, that we were talking about what's goodwill. Well, goodwill is supposedly, right, goodwill. Well, how do you measure the value of goodwill? Your customer lists. How about going into a cafe and talking to customers? How happy are you with your espresso this morning, right? I can go, and I jokingly say, I can go do a happiness audit, tonight at any restaurant and look at people's smiling faces, go back in the kitchen, see how grumpy their chefs are. I can do an interesting audit, and I can tell that owner very quickly that they got some relational capital deficits here, or they got a lot of strengths because they're getting 5 stars or whatever from their customers. You look at Uber. So we see the emergence of new ways of measuring trust with stars or whatever. TaskRabbit, Airbnb, and so accountants haven't caught up to this, in my opinion, in the sense of how do you measure these intangibles in a way that it's not always monetized. In accounting, there's two ways. There's tax and audit. Sorry, that's all technical stuff. And then there's management accounting. Management accounting's gone missing. Management accounting is a realm of strategy. Where are we going, right? How happy are our customers? How happy are our staff, right? And we've developed with my little group called Genuine Wealth protocols for doing well-being audits of companies and actually showing business people how to, measure the well-being of your employees, including their spiritual well-being, right? And put that boldly, in the Volvo dealership, you got the well-being smiley face index, right? And when you walk in, you're like, how come the service guys are so grumpy? Aren't they they're called service. Well, because you got some front person who's shaking your hand, taking your money, and you walk in, you're all stressed, like, oh, I'm going to pay a lot for my Volvo repair, and you never shake the hand of Joe in the back. Those things like common sense stuff, but none of that stuff will appear on Volvos, right? Accounting statements. So we're into a new realm of pioneering, but we have to catch up to, I think, the reality that these intangibles, particular relationships, are more than just some mumbo-jumbo qualitative assessment. Because they do ultimately, I think, affect your bottom line. I don't know if that helps you. Sort of. Not satisfied. Yes.
Have you been to Bhutan and studied the gross national happiness?
No, but I've hung out with the Prime Minister in the UN. In 2012, I was invited by the Prime Minister to meet at this amazing meeting at the United Nations, and Prince Charles was talking to us, and the UN Secretary General. You know, and I have to say, as much as Bhutan is this like, wow, the happiness kingdom, you know, it's like the Swedes and the Danes are the happiest nation in the world. Like, the more homogeneous you are, if you have a benevolent king who can kind of go, you will live this way, you will have no TVs. What was interesting, one of my favorite speeches was at UTEP in El Paso. Never been to Texas. And the University of Texas is known as Bhutan on the border with Juarez, where they're killing each other across the border. And all the buildings are built in Bhutanese architecture. And I met all these young Bhutanese students from Bhutan. I said, tell me what it's really like. Right? So we were the president of the university, all these. Says, we think the king's going too fast. We're like 20-year-olds, and we think the young king has opened the borders too quickly. I said, oh, that's interesting. Now we have a new prime minister. The prime minister I met in 2012, out. Why? Because of all this pressure. Now they open their borders. Now the kids want their iPads, right? Now we got to start exporting, just like everybody else. Who are we going to trade with, China or India? So now a pro-business prime minister's in. So I was invited to come in 2 weeks ago. I was supposed to be in Bhutan. I said, are you going to pay my way? Oh, no, we don't have any money for that. It's like, well, hey, I got to put bread on the table too. I can't just like jump on a plane as much as I'm romantic about. So, but that said, Bhutan has done some amazing things. A few of us Canadians have actually helped write the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Household Survey, which takes 8 hours to fill out. They don't have computers, so you got to do it a log sheet. So we're using some of those analytic surveys now in Canada to look at well-being. So Bhutan is definitely a model. I don't think they've gone the ultimate step, which I would call a well-being-based governance system, but they're definitely a shining example of, you know, in a sea of otherwise kind of despairing pro-growth, you know, economies. Yeah. But again, my point is, when you open those borders, when you open your culture, right, that materialism comes rushing in, and it'll corrupt them too. So they have to watch it.
How much of the fact that we are actually suffering the curse of abundance that is causing our problems?
I think I have Pastor Rob. We were talking about that over dinner. The question is, how much do we think is the factor of consumption, right?
The curse of abundance.
The curse of abundance. Actually, that's a great point. That's something I often reflect on because, you know, Alberta, where I come from, we have the world's third largest reserve of oil and gas. It's called the tar sands, oil sands. We have a super abundant, like, except now when the oil is $45, so we're like all crying, right? Can't pay for my F-150 truck. And it's like, so there is a kind of paradox that I think that's a paradox of abundance. I think the truth is we have more than enough. So how do we, I would say sustainability is a big challenge. How can we relax into the truth of abundance? Because the lie is scarcity. And I love the word, I mean, probably people know this word fear. I love the word fear. False evidence appearing real. So our challenge is, even if we wanted to slow down, if we wanted to, I consider myself a villain of GDP because we have no debt and we've lowered our income needs have gone down because I have no mortgage anymore. So what does that mean? I can buy more stuff, buy a cottage or something, better car. But the choice to say no to that and say, wait a minute, that means I have more discretionary time to spend with young people or walk the girls to school. Those are luxuries that I think I want everyone to have. But compelling someone to make that choice to live more simply is difficult when we're encouraged that material things bring us happiness, when in fact most of us know that it's not true. So I think we have a challenge we have a spiritual malaise, we have some serious soul searching to do. But it's an interesting conundrum that the truth is abundance, and yet money has become this kind of, it's broken that, I think that's why Jesus got mad at the money changers, saying, what are you charging a tax on This is a pure it's a pure offering to God. So, big challenges. Question?
Question is, if you were to build a new, from scratch, let's say a society of 300 people, how much do you think that the pool of money would be to start?
Question was, if you started with a brand new, aren't there 300 people in this room? I'll just bet you outside there's 300 people. If we were to start tonight, how much money would we think we would need? Well, I've got the spreadsheet to tell you that. You could say, my father, it's funny, Peter's compelled me to write this book called Money Grows on Trees, which I did promise I'd bring my draft manuscript. It's on my laptop. I didn't print it. I didn't want to kill any trees. But the amazing thing is I interviewed my father, who came from Germany in 1953, and I said, I want to talk to you about money. He's going to be 80 next week. I said, what was it like when you were in Germany and after the war? And he goes, it was horrible. We were given, the Reichmark was worth nothing, and we were given food coupons, but just enough to live. He said, just enough to live, not enough to die. I'm like, really? And then what happened? Well, I did it for 2 years, and then the Marshall Plan came in, and they brought in this allied currency, and we had 40 marks a month, I think, every person. So suddenly the stores were full again, and people could consume things, and the factories started going. So I thought, wait a minute, so in his own lifetime, he lived an experience where the amount of money that was created was just enough, right, to fulfill the basic needs. You could design a perfect diet on the calories. I can say the living wage of America should be $15 an hour, guaranteed. Nobody should go with less. I can show you that the GDP of the economy needs to only be half of what it is. I've taken out debt, and I've taken out waste. A lot of our fridges and that have built-in obsolescence. Why? Because the factories have to keep things, inventory moving. So you take imagine how much efficiency you could squeeze out. And then you can decide, well, maybe the wage only needs to be $5 or $10. So we could design the exact wage to meet the needs of everyone, at least basic needs. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be allowed to aspire to be Bill Gates. I'm just saying there's something wrong when that doesn't get redistributed from time to time either. So those are the we could design enough currency to, I said, this Earth dollar was sufficient to make sure a watershed, and I would plan at the watershed level, all watersheds were healthy. They're producing clean water constantly, regularly. No liabilities, no ecological liabilities or chalking up as they are now. All these things could be designed in a spreadsheet tonight. It's not hard. I mean, I do it for myself. I do a living wage for our own household. How much, do I need to make as a consultant this year? Right? It's not hard. I can give you my spreadsheet. You're welcome.
Well, your last question. I have one then.
Okay. What about all those students' questions?
Oh, yeah, that's right. What about you students? Yes, it should be me, the last one. Come on, students, you all wrote questions. I see you out there. In a student question, a brave student. Where's a brave soul?
Those are the questions?
You don't want me to call on you, do you? Hop up. I know where you are. Brandon, let's go. Stand up.
Come on, Brandon.
I just had to see. Sorry, up.
I don't have my question.
But you can remember it. What? You can remember the gist of it. I have them here. Well, it's a long list. You have to find it on here. I'm sure where you are.
So one thing I want to compel students is, I don't have all the answers. I think out of our creativity, we can design a way better system. And we won't get it right. We've been tinkering with this for a long time, right? And what I'm saying, some people say, oh, well, you know, it's like, I guess it's like the Israelites and Moses, like, oh, what's wrong? The current system might be debt slavery, but what's the alternative? It seems more complicated. We have to make decisions. We have to sit around in circles and say how much money we create tonight for Cincinnati tomorrow, right? That's what we'd have to do. And that would be hard. There'd be lots of arguments and, oh, why does Susie deserve more? Like, she spent 7 years studying medicine, and, you know, like, Joe's just a plumber, and, you know, these aren't going to be, these would be difficult. And you'd say, well, I think the current system, there's nothing wrong with it, right? It's not broken. But is it unjust? Is it inefficient? So I think we need to begin conversations in the classrooms and with our kids, right? And my most important message, just be self-aware, like, and don't take my word. There's lots of stuff on YouTube you can watch that tells a maybe more eloquent story, but the solutions aren't really that self-evident, at least the practical ones.
Yeah. So obviously you seem to be coming from a Catholic tradition.
Obviously.
Are you familiar with the Potlatch and the Native American tradition and Marcel Mauss studied that, and the gift economy, that whole idea of the general economy as well versus high?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how that maybe is at odds with what you're talking about, or is similar?
So the question is, what about indigenous customs of the potlatch? And one of my inspirations is indigenous people. So I work a lot with indigenous people, and you know, if anyone's ever spent time with elders, spent time in a sweat lodge, you know, gone to a Sundance, gone to a potlatch. I mean, what was a potlatch? A potlatch was it was giving to the community from your abundance, and you would prepare a whole year, and your family would prepare a massive feast, and it was a giving. It was like a joke. It's like, to me, it revealed the truth of the Creator's abundance, right? I can amass or have the biggest party, right, in the community, but every household would hold a party, and it would be every year or whatever the timing was, and a lot of that stuff, of course, came from nature anyways. It didn't come from manufactured things, but blankets. And so the potlatch was a custom on the West Coast. And so my jacket is from Haida Gwaii, from a woman who does, Haida Gwaii work. And to me, they're my inspiration. I think I still have one in my pocket. You know, the cowrie shell. You know, when I went, I met, anyone ever heard of the Onondaga people? The Iroquois. You know the story of the Iroquois? Do you know who they inspired? Right? Your story, it's, Ben Franklin, right? The Iroquois Confederacy was the model for the colonies. So I had the pleasure a year and a half ago of going to the Longhouse and meet Chief Warren Lyons, 83-year-old spirit, Turtle Clan chief and leader of spiritual leader of the Onondaga people. And the Onondaga people live on the sacred lake Onondaga near Syracuse, the most toxic lake in America, Superfund site. And they said, we've invited you here because we think you can help clean Lake Onondaga. Says, we're going to help you clean up. I'm not, right? And so the beauty of meeting Orrin was we walked in that longhouse, and we'd driven 5 hours from New York. And we were invited in, and Orrin had us sit down across. So the longhouse is very long. There's 50 clans. And I knew that I'd arrived in paradise because this culture was still a matriarchal culture. The women elect the chiefs for life, and they have the right of recall. So we walk in, and I'm looking at all the scenery. So there's 50, osprey headdresses on the wall. The chiefs are at the front, and the guests sit over here, and the women are here. And there's a table in the middle of the hall, and there it is, the double row wampum belt. The wampum belt was the wampum treaty with George Washington was a treaty that said, as long as the rivers flow, our two people will journey together. And that wampum belt had been stored in the New York Museum of Natural History or something, and it had just come back. And then he told us, you're actually not allowed to be in our longhouse because we're in the middle of a 30-day ceremonial period. I'm like, oh my goodness, what? We drove like 5 hours and you're just going to send us back to New York? And then he kind of smiled and goes, just kidding, we'll meet you at the hockey rink, we'll buy you lunch. Like, you know, they have such a great sense of humor. But Orrin is one of the few guys that knew the story of the Wizard of Oz. He said, you know, Mark says, you know that the flying monkeys was us, Indians. The Wicked Witch of the West was Mother Nature. They had to ground the monkeys, right? And the Homestead Act of Lincoln, right, took the land, conquered the West. So anyways, the point is this wampum belt, what was it? A bunch of seashells sewn onto fabric or buckskin, which again represented, it would be like piling all the gold of Cincinnati onto a table and saying, come, set the, you know, it's like a joke. So I'm inspired by Indigenous people. I think they will lead it. They're like our monasteries. I think the few, you know, we killed most of them off, right? And they became alcoholics. We abused them in schools, and just horrible. And yet they're like these children who came out from the Garden of Eden, never left it, and we came here and destroyed it with our money power. You know, and the story is the same in America as it is in Canada. It's a horrible story, but yet they're still around, and they have these legends that the Tree of Life still exists, and we're going to find the few people who still know where it is will know how to get back to it. So I have the pleasure of hosting. Now I get to host circles on the land. And our last circle in Edmonton, we called it the Circle Wampum, because that's Warren Lyon's vision of what's going to happen. No longer that 2-row wampum, it's going to be a circle wampum. Right? That's the future. And so I'm helping them achieve financial sovereignty, because they're small. They're like 300 people, some of them. I can design, and they're called nations, by the way. There's 640 First Nations in Canada. I'm helping them design new money systems, interest-free banking, asset-based, right, economy. They can do it. That's why I'm so pumped. You know, 300 million Americans, that's too much. Like, but 300, you know, enlightened.
This is not the land of utopia.
Anyways, thank you for the question, because I'm inspired by them. So.
Okay. Oh, yeah, one more, and then we're going to wrap it up.
So, we're sitting out here and yeah, we like your approach. I want to buy into it. Can you give me 2 or 3 steps that are doable that we can take to move in the direction you're suggesting?
2 or 3 steps that are doable. Means I have to come down from 30,000 feet, as Peter knows. It's hard. Like, the air gets thinner when I get them down. But I mean, I have to say, like, I know in my own life, I can only speak from my experiences. You know, getting out of debt, trying to, you know, it's an old adage. Try to live within your means. Like, don't encourage your kids to get addicted to credit, and, you know, learn how to save again. You know, all the pressures and problems of the macro system will still exist. Let's start talking about money. Let's form these conversational circles. Let's refinancing our neighbors' debts if we can, right? Why are neighbors paying 18-24% on their credit cards when it's completely ridiculous? And maybe they're ashamed to talk about it. So let's start with our neighbors. Start in our neighborhoods. I think that's what we're trying to do. That's what you're trying to do in Cincinnati. So join those, join the Economics of Compassion. You're part of it already, I bet. Not yet? Sort of? On the sideline? Come, you know, join us. We got 2 days of this conversation, right? Coming up?
That's the perfect segue, right?
Yeah, it's a good segue to the promo for the rest of the week. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Mark Anielski for his talk today. Truly some new ideas. So thanks, and we do hope to see many of you at the Neighborhood Economics Conference tomorrow and Wednesday, taking place all day at Xavier's Gallagher Theater. And stay tuned for spring semester events here and Economics of Compassion events, including we'll be having another Jubilee lecture at the Clifton Mosque on December the 3rd. Is that correct? At 6:30 p.m. So that's the next event in the Jubilee series. Thank you all for coming.